I think I would like to start with a flashback down your own life to the 80s. How did you look upon Thatcher at that time?
Well, in a very reductive way. I looked at her as, I think probably I would have assigned 3 sentences to her, my assessment of her. You know, friend of Reagan, conservative, bad hair, dowdy clothes, unfashionable. These are the things, honestly, I wasn't a particularly political animal at that time, but I knew I didn't agree with her policies. At the same time, in 1979, when she was elected prime minister, my friends and I were all, yes, sort of secretly thrilled that a woman had been elected head of state, because it was absolutely unheard of.
What about your view today after playing Mrs. Thatcher?
Now I have a greater appreciation of the size of that achievement, and sort of a deeper understanding of the machinations that made it possible, how she worked her way through, the compromises that she made, the choices that she made in order to follow through with her very zealous convictions about policy matters.
She's better than her reputation.
Well, it's not a judgment that I make about her, honestly. I really don't, because I don't... In this film, I don't think we're taking a political stand. The political stand we take is that we're looking at her life now, as an old woman who suffers from dementia.
Why is that important?
Because that's an important person. The people that are big and powerful and on their way to something grand, they take up all the pages of history. But the idea that a little old lady in the street who buys milk is equally important. She's us. And how she approaches the end of her life, how all of us will approach the dark corridor, and how we'll consider our lives in retrospect. It's just that this little old lady happened to be the leader of the UK for the longest serving prime minister in the 20th century.
Thoughts about going so close to her private life?
No, that was the part that interested me most. I mean, and that's the part that's completely imagined, because we don't have reams and reams of documentary footage of her in her triumphalist moment and during the downfall. Lots of documentary about that. But her life now, her quiet life now, behind the scenes, making a reconciliation with the totality of her life, looking back at it, that's the part that we imagined, and that's the part that interested me, because it was hidden and we don't know about it. But it becomes a very personal story about a very political person.
I think that will surprise many viewers, because a film about Thatcher is something you expect to be a political film. And now we are in Shakespeare's own country. Tell me, what do we get?
Yes, well, we get maybe what we get when we look at... we don't look at Hamlet to think how Denmark was ruled at that time. We look at it for the questions of existence, and that's... We're not Shakespeare, but our attempt is to understand something through the prism of this life, this public life, but to understand something about our own existence and our own choices in life, and how you come to the end of your life, what you regret, what you've given up, what things matter, who matters, who stands with you at the end, who's there, what you care about at the end, that's what this is about.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Shoulders back, tummies in.
Tell me, how did you do it? The voice.
Well, I'm a little bit of a sponge. I pick up things easily. I like to feel what it feels like to speak, move, act in a way that's not the way I speak, move, and act. Because I feel like it's a way into understanding someone else. It's an act of empathy to affect another person's life. I read all sorts of things, all the vitriol against her. I read all the hagiographies. I read biographies. I looked at documentary footage. I went on YouTube and looked at her speaking before Parliament. And then it just sort of goes in, and I don't work it. I don't practice anything. But it was a total immersion, and I did it really, the physical manifestations, the voice, I really did it in about a 2 weeks period in London, when I just shut myself up in a room and did that.
How was it to portray a woman you have never met?
I've portrayed a lot of women that I've never met.
Would you like to have a discussion with Thatcher, with the person you are portraying?
Oh yes, it would be interesting to speak with her. It would be very interesting. But that opportunity, I don't have that opportunity. She's withdrawn from public life, and she's only engaged with people who are very close to her now. But if I could, I would like to ask her how and if her mind has changed about anything since she left office, how she feels about the European Union and everything now, and China. It would be interesting to know her point of view, because she was always so very famously over-prepared for every conversation. And she did deep research, and she worked harder than everybody around her. And all the people that worked around her said that. And they were all terrified of her over-preparation, because they knew that she knew more about their subject than they did. And when she reached into her handbag and brought out the briefing papers, about the man's expertise that she sat opposite, their hearts went in their shoes, because they knew she was going to pull up something that they weren't prepared for. So yeah, I think that she'd be very interesting on the state of the world now.
What idea did you have of Margaret Thatcher before you started this project?
Well, I think I regarded her in a very reductive way. I think I thought of her as a friend of Reagan, conservative, not in agreement with her policies, weird hair, funny clothes, dumpy, English, not interesting. And that's the way we're very harsh, women, as we judge each other,
especially women,
especially public figures, and I was guilty of that. And as I learned more about her, I became more. I still don't agree with many of her positions, and yet there were many surprises in my research.
Like?
Well, that, when we think of conservative people now in America, she would be not allowed in the party at all, because she was pro-choice. She was an early advocate of global warming, understood the importance of that. She was remarkably unbiased in this very specific culture of the Tory party. She didn't, there were homosexual scandals within her inner circle, and she kept the person right with her. She said, "Stay with me all day, and this will go away." And so those are things that wouldn't happen in America. She'd be disregarded by the conservatives, and she would be labeled some sort of Clinton, Republican.
She was one of the few women in a man's world.
Yeah.
How extraordinary was that?
Well, I mean, at that time, the world was different. There was no Angela Merkel. There was no, there was Evita Peron. You could come into power on the coattails of your husband if he'd been particularly powerful. But that was it. That's how you got in. First leader of the head of state in the West. A world that was exclusively men at its highest levels. There were other women in Parliament. I think there were 17 women, but there were 635 members of Parliament. So it was largely a man's world.
Now you became Thatcher a world leader for a certain period. Can you imagine what it's like, having that power, that responsibility?
I did try to imagine what it was like. I mean, I looked at her daily calendar and the volume, the sheer volume. Again, without computers, she would come home with 3 suitcases filled with business, briefs, reports. And she would sit down. She slept 4 or 5 hours a night. She'd sit down with a little glass of scotch and she'd go through every single piece of legislation, and she'd comment on it and outline it in her distinctive blue Pentel pen. And she was formidable in her appetite and capacity for digesting information, retaining it, and being able to act on it the next day. Her willingness to take the very special venom that was hurled at her. I mean, the most hated woman in British politics. There are many of the architects of the policies that she implemented that are walking around and still sort of important in British political life, but they don't have the hatred isn't leveled at them, even though they were equally complicit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a...
Meryl Streep, thank you so much for joining us here at 35mm.
Thank you.
So welcome to London. How are you finding
Thank
it
you.
so far?
Well, it's disconcerting to see my puss on the every
Yeah.
bus,
It's everywhere, isn't it?
It's everywhere.
But good on you though, because I have to say, an astounding movie.
Oh, thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
It is about the Iron Lady, and here in Britain, she's seen as somewhat of a controversial figure, So when approaching the role, was her reputation something that you were thinking about the whole time?
Well, her reputation and how controversial she was sort of part of what intrigued me about playing her, because I myself was guilty of reducing her to a sort of a dismissible object of scorn, I have to say. When I was younger, I thought, friend of Reagan, weird clothes, conservative, not interested. You're too young to know, but I remember the days when there were no women in law school. None. The professions open to us were teacher and nurse. Or hooker, I guess. That was always open, always an option. Actress, same thing. It was a very limited vision that people had for women. And that's changed radically. And you can't help but think that the door cracked open a little bit just because she got there.
We're aware, you've been nominated for a Golden Globe. With that, there is obviously Oscar buzz and everything. As an Oscar winner, what does that feel like when you're there in the ceremony and they call your name?
I have to cast my mind back 30 years to remember what that's like. Honestly, I have, I've lost so many times that's the thing I remember more.
No,
Well,
really?
honestly, yes, I've lost 15 times. So I have
On the
a
positive
lot
side.
of speeches that have never been made.
Well, there's
And
an
if I
opportunity
win
for
this
every
time,
moment.
I'll get up and give them all.
And can I just say that if you don't win, Meryl, the world has gone crazy. It has gone crazy. So we're here at Sky, we're definitely rooting for you, and
Oh, cool.
we'll all go nuts if it's not Meryl Streep being called this time round. I'm just going to put that out there. So if you win, please try and remember this moment.
Okay, Robin, and I remember your name.
Thank you so much
My
for talking to us.
pleasure.
It's been an absolute honour. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
time.
Very kind of you.
Meryl Streep, welcome to 7:30. You're playing one of the most controversial, divisive figures in recent modern history. That must have been an incredibly intimidating role to take on.
It was, but it was looking at the most divisive woman in British history from the point of view of age, from the vantage point at the tail end of a very tumultuous career. And through her own eyes, through the lens of the person who lived it. So it's not sort of documentary truth or any sort of thing. It's 3 days in the life of an old woman and the memories that are provoked by the upset of those days.
How do you prepare for something like that? I mean, you come from a different culture, effectively. The accent is different. You're playing two ages. Extraordinarily challenging.
Yeah, in Australia I played an extraordinarily controversial, divisive character in Lindy Chamberlain. Someone everybody sat on one side or the other about. And maybe there's a pattern in my life that I want to sort of defend the humanity of people that we've made into emblematic figures of one sort or another, figures of hatred or saints, How do I do that preparation? Just an immersion. I have a musician's, I guess, ear for the sound of the voice. But it's also important to me, in the case of someone who is controversial, to get the outlines of the character right, because how they present themselves to the world has a great deal to do with how people feel about them.
How would you define this film? It's not a entirely political film. It's part feminism. It's also part the ending of someone's life and the attainment of power and the loss of power. But how do you define it?
Well, the filmmakers, a woman wrote it, a woman directed it, I'm in it, a woman edited it. The point of view is different from most films because of that, because it's a film that's interested in an older woman and in the losses and in the choices that she made and whether she regrets any of them or where her remembered glory lies and how she remembers the challenges that she faced.
Was she a feminist, do you think?
I think that she was a woman who broke ground. I think she rejected the idea that she owed anything to the feminist movement in Britain, and certainly the feminist movement in Britain had no time for her either. She was notoriously, she didn't advance women within her own party necessarily or for any reasons of, a special advancement. But she was a feminist, whether she likes it or not, because she set about to do what we all feminists want, which is to break through the barriers that exist.
It's also a very poignant story of decline, having been at that height and having then losing those powers. How much did you draw on your own experience with your own family and friends to portray that?
Well, a lot, because I didn't have access to Mrs. Thatcher. I didn't, and really she's withdrawn from public life for the past 10 years, for the most part. So that was an imaginary journey, and that honestly was the thing that interested me most. How great people reconcile with the loss of power, and how much being a leader, being a political leader, being willing to stand up and in some measure sacrifice one's family on the altar of either your desire for the public good or your own ambition or some combination of both things. But the cost of what a public life is really interested me. We ask it of our men and women, but we hold women to a different standard in terms of their families. And we certainly looked at Dennis Thatcher in a different way than we look at any First Lady.
Do you feel differently now about it, having played her and immersed yourself in her character?
Yes, I have. I mean, obviously, I know much more about her. I still disagree with many of the politics, but she turns out maybe to have been right about one or two things that...
Such as?
Well, I think it was smart to keep the sovereignty of the pound. I think that proved a good idea. I think it was a good idea to have people purchase their own council housing flats, for instance. It improved communities and improved the idea of proprietary interest in a community. You know, a few other things. But generally, I don't go with her policies. But she was also, there were many surprises learning about her. For instance, she would not be regarded as a conservative in American politics because her social policies ran afield of that. In my research, I ran into someone who was in the room when she just tore apart the president of the United States and his vice president for using abortion rights. And she was famously pro-choice. And she recognized global warming early on. And she refused to vilify members of her cabinet or her inner circle who had homosexual scandals. And she said, "You stand by me all day, and this will all go away." I mean, that would be her death knell in American politics. So, what we call conservative, and there were lots of surprises embedded in her story.
You've been universally acclaimed. You're used to that, but one area of total failure is you haven't played the Hollywood game. You've married the same guy. You've stuck with him. Your family are normal, and they're not in rehab. Where have you gone wrong?
So far, so good. And I think he stuck with me more than I. I think the credit is all due over there, frankly. I never look, a gift horse in the mouth, and I've been really lucky. I'm aware of that. And my career has been given to me by the people I've worked with, no question. The actors, the directors, the cinematographers, the writers, all of whom gave me the opportunity to work in the way that I have, and I'm really grateful.
Meryl Streep, thanks for giving us your time now.
Thank you.